All these, the living and those who have gone, have touched our lives as well as many more. May we bless and be blessed. Back in 1993, when I interviewed for a case manager position for the Southeast Wisconsin AIDS Project, I knew then that I was eventually going to leave to become a UU minister as soon as the opportunity arose. So I informed the interviewer that I could only guarantee staying 2 years. It was the only time I tendered my resignation during the interview. I was hired, with everyone knowing that my time was limited, and such was the case with my clients. We went into the relationships knowing that our time was limited, theirs by disease. All we had to offer medically was AZT, which was limited in its effectiveness, and the doctors also prescribed other medications to treat opportunistic infections. The whole process felt like having a person over the cliff, dangling on a rope and holding onto the rope and feeling it slip slowly. There was little hope, but hope is what I saw saving lives. 2 long-term survivors I remember that had hope. Susie, an ex-heroin addict, found hope in Pentecostal religion. The high of ecstatic speaking in tongues replaced her cravings for drugs. I did not challenge her assumptions, as some who've taken my Bible course might think that I would, because I could see the confidence that her faith gave her. I was with her at the Assembly of God when she and her doctor held a special meeting to educate people in that congregation, people that would listen to her and who had never had invited the radicals from the AIDS Project. And then there was Jeannie, a biker, had a different type of faith, a faith that she drew from Native American spirituality. And I remember her coming into my yard and gathering up some dead grapevines that I was longing to get rid of because they just overrun my fence. And then seeing them weeks later all woven into wreaths, of bringing something very hopeful out of dead trash in my backyard. I came to understand the power of hope itself, and I became less self-righteous about demanding people share my hopes and dreams. I remember reading research about a drug, I think it was Befor. It was to replace AZT in the alphabet soup. And they had this chart in the medical journals, and I usually went to the charts because that's what I could understand. And it showed that 50% of those who took it had a positive outcome, but also that 33% of those who had only taken the placebo had gotten a positive outcome. Now the difference was significant, and it showed the drug's effectiveness, but I was struck by how many were helped by the placebo alone. Those who received no medication got worse. The effect of believing that one might get better accounted for more of the effect than the added effect of the drug alone. So I began to see that as my job, to encourage hope. For without hope, my clients would not change their risky behaviors. Why? Would they have any incentive? Without hope, they would not follow the medical regimen. Hope of survival was the key to survival. And in many ways, it was an unrealistic hope. It wouldn't actually save anybody's life, but it might give them another year, and that itself was a blessing. After working in hospice, when I was brought in the last 6 weeks of somebody's life, and the families didn't seem to quite get it yet that Grandpa was going to die, I had this crusade against denial. And then I found myself in my next job working to build up people's denial systems. Because if you took the full implication of what this diagnosis means, it would add so much stress to one's life that would certainly suppress the immune system more. And so though denial has some benefit for those living with HIV, it is the enemy of AIDS prevention. AIDS prevention requires looking the problem straight in the eye and clear and accurate information. When I started working with the AIDS Project, the consensus was that oral sex was not a risky behavior. But as I left the agency, first reports to the contrary were coming in, and now it's clearly established as a risk factor. Condoms with spermicide are an effective barrier, though not 100%. I remember having to counter information that stemmed from the religious right that discounted the effectiveness of condoms. They wanted the health department to stop distributing them. They felt condoms encouraged sex. I had to remind them that people figured out to have sex long before condoms were invented. And last year in the OWL class, our teens asked if we could have a bowl of condoms in the lobby for whenever they wanted them. I didn't go that far. But I do have condoms in my office, and the teens are aware of that, and some have approached me regarding that, giving them a teachable moment where I encourage them to talk with their parents, and I'm sure they do. At the UUA General Assembly last year, there was a booth handing out literature arguing that HIV was not the cause of AIDS. And this literature is deceptive because it ignores much of the research that links HIV to AIDS, and it often argues from anecdotal evidence. They'll cite people who have HIV but no symptoms. And like all viruses, there are a few people who are resistant, but the exception does not disprove those who do have symptoms have them as a result of infection with HIV. In recent years, just as I was leaving the AIDS Project, new medication came out, and there's been great advances in treatment. And HIV has left the headlines. It's been around for over 20 years, and it's no longer an automatic death sentence, and it's no longer news. Yet it remains an epidemic. The Center for Disease Control states that there are over 13,000 people living with HIV and AIDS in North Carolina. That means in this state you are 4 times more likely to find an HIV positive person than a Unitarian Universalist. And these are only the reported cases. Many more. Just as there are UUs who don't know it, there are many people with HIV who don't know it. And people can be infected for up to 10 years and not have symptoms. That's a long time. If you have had unprotected sex in the last 10 years, you are at risk. And your children are at risk. And you need to talk with them even when it's awkward. You may hope your children are not experimenting with sex, but do not let your hope be denial. And if you start the conversation early, perhaps it can continue matter-of-factly as they approach adolescence. When Ben was born, I committed myself that if he asked a question, I would answer it. That backfired, or it made me uncomfortable once when it came to Billy. Billy was a client in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and he often volunteered at the front desk. He was very friendly with Ben, who was 4 years old at the time. They used to laugh and tease, and Billy said he wanted shoes like Ben. Ben had sneakers that are only really available to toddlers. They were sneakers that were bright red, blue, and yellow, and green. You might say Billy had a flair for the dramatic. One day, Ben asked, "Where's Billy?" And I had to tell him that Billy died. And so Ben asked, "How did he die?" So I told him that he had an infection. My son, being ever then as he is now, asked me, "How did he get the infection?" I told him that he got it because he was not careful when he had sex. Now Ben, having already had the "where do babies come from" talk, asked, "Did the women he had sex with die?" Well, actually, Billy had sex with men, and they did die, and it's very sad, and that's why Daddy works where he does. He wants teach people to be safe when they have sex. Now, I've only given you a summary of this conversation. It seemed to take forever. He was a persistent questioner. I was conflicted. As a parent, I had made the commitment to answer his questions honestly, but I was nervous when he kept on asking questions, and relieved when I did not have to give him the particulars about anal sex. But hopefully, I have laid the groundwork early, and we have been able to talk more conversation to talk about sex over the years. And hopefully he will continue to talk with me during adolescence, but he may, like most kids, make me the last person he wants to talk to about sex. And that's where we can rely on each other in the community. But then, when he's an adolescent, it will be my job to raise the questions and not wait for him to ask, as I do now. And I'm asking the parents here to go home today and talk with your children. It's good that this fellowship offers classes on the facts of life and even about relationships and a lot of things about sexuality. But all that information that they get is more helpful if it's placed in the context of relationship. For though AIDS is a global problem, it is also very personal. And the best way to prevent it is person-to-person contact. In some ways, success has caused prevention efforts to be downplayed recently. The amount of U.S. AIDS death peaked around 50,000 in 1995. And with the new drugs, that number was under 10,000 in 2000. People know now that it can be treated, but that sometimes translates into people being less careful. But the drugs, though effective, do not mean an end to AIDS. I remember when they came out and having to counsel people that if you can stand vomiting for a month straight, it will bring your T counts back up. It will help you. But it's a hard drug to take. They were 9 to 12 large pills per day. It's very strong medicine, and it does long-term damage to vital organs. And there are starting to be cases of organ failure into long-term survivors. So despite the present rosy picture painted by the press, HIV still is a very difficult disease to manage. And among those with little access to health care, it's devastating. The choir sang, "God help the outcasts." Those among us who are theists would then go envision ourselves as the arms and legs and hearts of God. And those who do not envision a God still have arms and hearts and legs to help. To help those who are marginalized by society. The illness has been moved from being a gay disease to a disease of blacks and Hispanics who are poor. Worldwide, heterosexual transmission has always been the primary mode, and the U.S. numbers are beginning to align with that. Much of the progress in this country occurred because of the activism of gay men who stood up, whose lives may have been closeted, but they realized that silence equals death, and that they had to take risks in their own lives to save those of the lives around them. And prevention efforts have been most successful in that community. We need a strategy that maintains the gains in that population while putting resources into areas where the disease is growing fastest. From the beginning, AIDS has been associated with shame and outcasts. In the early 80s, the risk groups were considered gay men, IV drug users, and refugees from Haiti. And the old joke went, the hardest part about having HIV is trying to convince your family that you're Haitian. People screamed that AIDS was God's punishment for homosexuals, to which I replied, since God gave lesbians the lowest rate of HIV infection, that must be the sexuality she prefers. Prevention gets harder to sell to those on the edge of society. People for whom protection is carrying a gun in case the drug deal goes bad. People taking that level of risk are unmoved by the possibility of developing symptoms 5 years from now if they don't use a condom. When a greater society tells a subgroup that they are disposable, certain members of that subgroup will believe it. When people have their dreams deferred, when they are robbed of their long-term goals, is it any wonder they cherish short-term pleasure and escape? If life is constant suffering, what is the incentive to preserve it? This is not discounting the personal responsibility each individual can take to prevent HIV. But it's curious how personal responsibility is demanded more of AIDS patients than of other diseases. Heart disease is exacerbated by eating animal fat, which is not considered a sin. Smokers at this time are marginalized but they're not considered sinners deserving punishment. But even these diseases of personal habits have a social component. Poor people are more likely to have high-fat diets that lead to heart disease, and nicotine chemically reduces stress and is cheaper than going to the psychiatrist. When people's acute needs are great, they are less able to make choices that prevent chronic disease. They seek comfort of a cigarette, cheeseburger, heroin, sex. In addition to teaching personal responsibility, we need to be aware of our social responsibility. How do we create a society where the needs are not so great? The disparity present in our country is even greater when you take it on a worldwide scale. In some African countries, 25% of the people are living with AIDS. How do we create an infrastructure of food, shelter, and jobs that creates a foundation upon which prevention messages can be heard? There are vaccines being tested, but will they be available only for the wealthy, as current AIDS drugs are? The pharmaceutical companies have been getting good press lately because they've cut the cost on some of their drugs that they're giving to the third world. But for the most part, they're cutting costs on the old drugs that are less effective. The solutions to this problem, it's hard to call it a crisis anymore because it's been with us so long. It is one of the facts of our lives that all of our teens never knew a world without AIDS. AIDS attacks our defenses, both physically and socially. We can use barriers that protect us from the virus, but we must destroy the barriers that allows it to spread among the poor. Protecting those whom we may perceive as the other, as the outcast, is ultimately the best way to protect ourselves. I'm sure others have had experience with this illness. Please share them with us now.
My brother and his partner, who just visited with me from New York, are a good example of the turnaround. Tony, my brother's partner, was on death's doorstep about 10 years ago until he started protease inhibitors. He's got arms just big around now. His biggest objective is making it to the gym. That's his addiction. And so he can go and work out. It was just an absolute joy to be around him. And instead of looking toward death, which they did for a long time, they spent most of their money traveling the world and doing things because they were sure he was going to die. Now they're just looking towards the future.
I had both the sadness and the joy of being with a beloved colleague. First, his partner died, and he was a model of nursing that partner. And then there were those of us who were his close friends to help him through his passage. And one of the greatest gifts was seeing them live with great joy as long as they could, and then to be profoundly present at the moment of Bill's passing was a gift to all of us.
In 1996, Charlie and I moved to Maryland, and they brought the AIDS Club down to the mall. And they said it was going to be the last time that they would display the quote on the mall because it had gotten so large that they can't accommodate it anymore. So we went to see the AIDS Club. We took Benjamin, It was one of the first times we realized Ben was learning to read, because he read a name and he said there are too many L's or too many I's in the name Bill. But we walked from the Washington Monument down to the Capitol building, and we tried to see as much of the quilt as we could. And then we said, let's take Ben to the Air and Space Museum. He loved that. And so mentally, I was prepared to let go of the place I was in while I was with the club. You know, I looked at it, I felt moved, I was appalled at how large it was. Mentally, I was ready to move on to something fun. I'm going to do it with my kid now. We walked across the street to go down to the museum, and I just stopped because on the grass, all along the way, all the way down toward the museum, was more of the quilt. And psychologically and emotionally, I was not prepared for that. It was very strange. I cried. I hadn't cried before, but it was just the shock of all of that we had just walked through. More of it. And I guess I'm telling you this story because it would be so easy to feel like we do our part, and you know we send money or we sponsor someone in the AIDS walk, but it's real live people and real losses, and emotionally, even though you don't want to burn yourself out, you can't just turn away from it. And I hope I'm explaining this well enough. I'm not going to belabor it, but it was for me a profound moment because I felt like I had been living with AIDS very well. My husband worked with it. I met people. I went to their houses. But all of a sudden, it just struck me. It was too much. And I think that sometimes you just have to be aware that those living with AIDS, they never walk away from that. They always live with it. And our gifts of love and time and attention and personal contact can make that so much easier.
I'd just like to inject the word here about safety. We're talking about condoms, teaching your kids about condoms. If your kids are going to shoot up any kind of medication, and they may, remind them in this state, in North Carolina, anybody can walk into any pharmacy and buy a clean syringe. They don't have to share it.
Gail, I saw the quilt when it was on the mall as well. And what struck me was what a huge loss it was to the world of all these wonderful, talented, and just wonderful people who had to have been good people, or someone wouldn't have gone all the trouble to make this piece for the quilt for them. And not only that, but only a small number of the people had a quilt piece made for them. And that was what really struck me, was what a loss it was for all of us, to our society and the world as a whole, of all the gifts that these people could have given, and now they were gone.
Let us join now in singing Abide With Me.
Love is not concerned with whom you pray or where you slept the night you ran away from home. Love is concerned that the beating of your heart should kill no one.
Let's turn page 1. Let's go.